Hi, my name is Richard Smith, and I am a survivor of various forms of violence, violence that happened in the community, survivor of sexual assault, sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. I'm also an activist, an educator, a healer, and a father. You know, my experience did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within the context of other forms of abuse and also other forms of oppression that were occurring in my community. As an African-American man, growing up during the height of, the war on drugs or the war on communities of color, mass incarceration. So there was a lot of other factors that made my experience of sexual abuse much more complicated, where it couldn't be a singular focus. There were other things that actually might have seemed like they took priority over my personal experience of sexual abuse. All of these other things occurring simultaneously, right? We have, substance abuse issues that are occurring inside of the home. We also have mass incarceration, communities being targeted. And then we also have this historical narrative of Black men being hyper-masculine and hypersexual and all of these things that I'm trying to manage and trying to navigate and figure out while simultaneously dealing with my personal experiences of harm that came as a child. And so these intersecting experiences really made it difficult for me to, one, gain a better understanding of who I was, to reach out to people for support, because it was something that took place in my community that didn't allow for us to express vulnerability. This was something that we had internalized, we being Black folks had internalized, that we need to just be strong, that we need to just push on, and we have to be survivors. And it did seem like there was a space for me to be vulnerable, to be weak, to be someone who was hurting. And then it started to manifest in socially appropriate behaviors, which in my case, in my community, was anger, was hypersexuality, that ultimately led me on a path to prison, coupled with these forces that were intentionally targeting my community to try to lock all of us up and capitalize and essentially monetize our trauma and capitalize on our trauma. One of the things that happened during my incarceration that really illuminated that my experience wasn't unique was that I found myself in a group with other men that we were facilitating for ourselves, because, one of the things I always talk about is for Black and brown folks, we got prison and, other folks get mental health support, other folks get, services to try to help them heal. And even though I know that men don't typically get the support that they need because of patriarchy, because of these other things, it's even more exacerbated for Black and brown folks. And so I found myself in a prison, facilitating a support group to help us heal from other things that we experienced. And then it came to light that we had all been victims of childhood sexual abuse. Nearly all of the guys in the group that I was working with had survived some form of childhood sexual abuse. And another thing that was really illuminating for me was that, many of us experienced sexual abuse at the hands of women, at the hand of adult women, nearly all friends of our parents. And we didn't even look at that as sexual abuse. We didn't look at that as sexual harm and violence. But we found ourselves in this predicament, kind of acting out on that unaddressed trauma. And then, the criminal legal system just gobbled us up because, we had no concept of what we experienced. We weren't able to communicate in a way that could clearly explain what we had been through. And then we didn't feel comfortable expressing it. But we found that in that space, in prison with each other. Unfortunately, it took that environment. And unfortunately, that environment we were able to create that space for ourselves in that environment, but it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. Black men should not have to go to prison to create space to heal. That says something that is entirely wrong with our system, our society, where we have to find a safe space in prison to heal. And I know way too many men, specifically Black and brown men, who've had that same experience. Since I've been out of prison, what I've done is I've really tried to recreate that space that we created in prison on the outside. I try to create it for myself. I try to create it for other men, other male survivors, other Black and brown male survivors, more specifically, holding groups, that allow us to talk and share in a way that we can see each other, we can relate to each other, no other spaces that we find ourselves in, right? And that's something that's been really critical for my continued healing journey. Just being able to communicate and find community with people who can identify and relate to the things that I've experienced, and I can relate to those things. So, that's been critical. Also advocacy, right? Because one of the things I believe is that trauma, distills down to powerlessness. And so the reclamation of my power through advocacy, through, the ability to have an influence on people who make decisions that impact my life and the lives of so many other Black and brown men has been a very empowering experience that is also equally healing for me. One of the things that, I've also learned because, my educational background is in social work. And so, I'm finishing up a PhD now in social work, and my research focus is male survivors of sexual abuse. And so, I kind of understand the therapeutic approach. I understand what mental health means, specifically from a Western perspective. But what I've found in my journey, and this is something that you all should take into consideration as well, is that healing occurs for us in spaces that may not look therapeutic, that may not involve a clinician. It might be a barbershop. It might be, you and your friends kicking it on the basketball court after a game. One of the things that I want folks to realize is that it doesn't have to be a traditional medical, clinical setting that offers us a space for healing. We can create spaces for healing for each other, right? Sometimes just listening and being able to talk to each other in a very vulnerable and transparent way opens us up to realize that, one, we're not alone, because I think that's what happened to me for many years. And to so many other people, you feel like you're alone, so you suffer in silence. But to realize that there are other people who've experienced these things, and also that there are other people who've experienced these things but are also healing. And that's what I kind of try to let my life exemplify. That trauma is real, specifically sexual violence and sexual harm is real, but healing is also very possible. And if we create the community for each other, we can find a space of healing that allows us to get past those things that have caused us to suffer in silence for so many years.